Welcome to everybody online. Thanks for joining. My name's Yabrinder Mali. I'm director of the Human Centre for Nature Recovery and professor of ecosystem science in this department. And this seminar series is part of a weekly seminar series that we have focusing on all dimensions of nature that's carrying on throughout this term and throughout subsequent terms. So before I introduce our speaker today, I'll run through some of the other talks. We've got an amazing lineup of speakers for this term. So do come along to all of them. And if you're not on the mailing list and you'd like to be, email biodiversity@ouce.ox.ac.uk or go to the Biodiversity Cluster website and you can sign on to be on the mailing list. I'll quickly run through the other talks we've got lined up this term. Next week we've got Catherine Brown on the Wildlife Trust, Action for Nature and Climate, Priorities and Challenges. The week after we've got Sophia Gomez and Vincent Merckx on below ground plant fungal interactions in forests. The week after we've got Bob Costanza from UCL and on the founders of ecological economics, so on overcoming our societal addiction to growth and building a sustainable well-being future. This is a new book that is just coming out that he'll be talking about. The week after we have Charlie Burrell of the Net Rewilding, one of the founding fathers of rewilding, and he'll be talking about rewilding. The week after, which we're still fixing the date, it's probably going to be on the Monday rather than on the Friday. It's a last minute one. We've got Patrick Greenfield from The Guardian. Some of you might have seen his article about red plus and the problems of red plus. And Patrick's going to come here and talk about the analysis that went into that article. That's a new one that we've just arranged. Right? So that's probably going to be on Monday the 6th of March. It'll be a Monday one. It might be on the Friday the 3rd. But so still trying to narrow down the diary dates there on that. But if you haven't seen a Guardian article, it's caused a huge amount of debate around carbon credit offset, so that should be a very interesting one. And the week after, Friday 10th of March, we've got Michael Dupledge from University of Exeter on environment and health, the search for a healthy environment. And then on the 17th, another new one, we've got Sandra Diaz, who's from Argentina, who's vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And she'll be talking, we have probably around the IPBES process and also the COP15 in Montreal and her experiences of international biodiversity agenda. So an amazing range of speakers that are lined up for this term. So do sign up for that. So now it gives me a pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, who is a new colleague of ours in Oxford. He's joined as an associate professor in climate change biology in the Department of Biology here. And he's also director of Wild Business Limited, which I'm sure he'll explain what that is in his talk. And his background, I just discovered he has an undergraduate in physics, just like me. So, and a master's in environmental technology and a PhD in conservation biology from Imperial College London, and spent a lot of his PhD and later work on expeditions in the former Aral Sea area of Uzbekistan. And since then, he's worked as a researcher at the University of Copenhagen and at the Durrell Institute for Conservation and Ecology in Kent. And alongside the science work, his biodiversity consultancy, Wild Business Limited, is to advise various private and public sector actors. And both his research and his consulting aim to explore whether and how net positive biodiversity outcomes and climate change mitigation can be achieved alongside economic development. So thank you, Joe. Welcome. I'm going to share the screen down. Good. Okay, that's
great. Thank you, Yabrinder. Thank you for that introduction. I think that's actually worse. Good. Thank you for that. Thank you all very much. Well, there's lots of people. Thank you very much for coming along today. It's very nice to see you all here today. And it's a real honour actually to be speaking in this list of speakers that Yabrinder just mentioned. Somewhat intimidating actually, so go really easy on me today. You would, that would be very nice. I'm going to talk today about nature positive and whether, fact or fiction is the title. But really, it's nature positive, is it going to work? Is kind of the subtitle. And I'll explain what nature positive is for people who aren't familiar with the term and the concept. But first, as I often do, I will start with just my own work, my own field work. I'm a conservation ecologist, really, primarily. And this is a picture from the shores of the current Aral Sea in Uzbekistan. You've been to mention that provided a lot of my work. And it's nice to see some of the sea there. I don't know how many people here are familiar with the case study of the Aral Sea in Uzbekistan. This is what the remaining sea looks like now. And it used to be this glorious, one of the largest inland seas in the world. It provided a huge amount of fish, for example, something like a quarter of the fish consumed by the Soviet Union, shows you what a big marine ecosystem it was. And all around the sea, you have this kind of relatively green grassland and shrubland, full of lots of, it's quite remote, so full of quite a lot of interesting threatened species and conservation interest species and so forth. It's a really quite interesting ecosystem only a few short decades ago. Now, if you travel to that part of the world, most of it looks more like this, which is kind of dramatic. Over 90% of the sea has disappeared. Just actually out of interest for a show of hands, how many people know about the Aral Sea crisis? Okay, quite a few, good. Yeah, it's quite a well-known case study. This is what it looks, you've probably seen the images from space. This is what it looks like from the ground. And most of the sea's gone. And the reason for that, as many of you probably know already, is primarily irrigation for cotton growing. So Uzbekistan is at the root of the global cotton supply chain, really. And the reason I show this is partly because it's nice pictures, I think, but also because if we think about nature recovery and nature positive as a mechanism, as an issue, one of the things we're really thinking about is this kind of thing, which is being repeated all over the world, right? This kind of loss of nature, and the fact we need to turn around this kind of thing. And to do so, we need to think about global supply chains and the impacts our decisions have in consumption and production. So what is nature positive? Again, another show of hands. How many people here know the term nature positive? Okay, good. Would anyone here be able to define it? Don't define it now, but do you think you could define it? No, okay. Everyone was right, I was actually going to challenge someone to do it. This is quite a nice place to start with nature positive. This is a schematic, but it comes from the data-driven paper published by David Leclerc and others in 2020. And this looks at, based on data and extensive modeling, they looked at the current historical baseline for biodiversity, measured using a couple of different metrics. You can see there it's declining up to 2010, and then different potential scenarios going forward, as I say, based on extensive integrated modeling. And particularly, they were looking at changes to production and consumption impacts on biodiversity globally, and saying that, we could have a business as usual case where we end up continuing to see biodiversity decline. We could have a case in which we have increased conservation efforts, the yellow one there, where we see biodiversity loss level out eventually in coming decades. Or with the right kind of concerted efforts to have more sustainable consumption and production, we could eventually have something like the green trajectory, where we actually eventually start to see biodiversity recover against loads of different metrics. And really, that's what we're talking about here, right? That kind of nature recovery. That's what nature positive would look like, was eventually going from where we are now to actually starting to recover biodiversity by a load of different measures. So how do we define nature positive then? Well, there's a few definitions out there, but the version I'm going to use today to talk about it comes from a paper written just last year by one of our own professors, E.J. Milner-Gullen, who talked about not diluting the term nature positive. And really, she was saying that we need to have some kind of measured baseline, starting point. So you could say the world today could be our baseline. And it has to be an absolute baseline, because we're talking about nature recovery against a certain point. Some kind of time frame we're talking about. And in many cases, people talk about nature positive as being something we want to see starting to be achieved by around 2030 onwards, which is obviously ambitious, but that's one of the things people talk about. Some kind of target, so where we're trying to get to, and with nature positive, we're trying to get somewhere above the current baseline, ideally a percentage above that baseline in terms of different biodiversity metrics. And then a load of concrete actions to actually take us there. Right? How are we actually going to get to that? It's obviously very much a nice to have, but what are the actions we're going to carry out and what they're going to cost and in what order to actually take us from where we are now concretely to nature positive? It's important to think about how we're going to add up all those different actions. And when we look at conservation globally, there's all kinds of different interventions we might implement to try and take us towards nature recovery. So how do we work out the combined effort, the aggregated effort of all of those different conservation interventions? And finally, crucially, monitoring and disclosure of progress towards that overall goal. So this is what we can define nature positive as. It has to have all of these components, and it has to be about getting towards nature recovery, not just preventing losses of nature, further losses of nature, but getting towards some kind of nature recovery by a certain time. That's from EJ's paper. Now, many of you will have followed the discussions towards the end of last year in December in Montreal during the Convention on Biological Diversity conference, where the kind of global biodiversity framework was agreed going forward for post-2020 onwards. And in the end, there was no explicit mention of nature positive in there, the phrase nature positive, but essentially it's aligned with this. So you can pull out the text from the Global Biodiversity Agreement, which talks about the mission by 2030 and towards the 2050 vision. And that's for the world to take this urgent action, crucially to halt and reverse biodiversity losses, putting nature on the path to recovery. So this is, even though it doesn't mention nature positive, this is consistent and fully aligned with this idea of nature recovery by a certain time. So this is kind of what policy is driving. And if we want to be serious about nature recovery, we can't just think about the direct impacts of the stuff we do around us, right? We can't just think about the impacts that we can see, say the building footprints around us or the crops in the fields outside the window. We need to be thinking about these global supply chains that lead to the kind of impacts that you see in that slide I first showed, the slide from the RLC. And if we're talking about global supply chains, then we have to talk about corporations, large corporations, because they're the ones that really have such an influence over these global supply chains, right? As well as the decisions we make. This is a figure that I like as an illustrative way of thinking about corporations and supply chains. So from Carl Folk and others just a couple of years ago. And in this figure, what they do is they show a whole list of different commodities that are traded globally, as you can see. But the outer circle is the percentage of each of those commodities that is controlled by a handful of large corporations. That's the number in the inner circle. So you can see in some cases, a very large percentage of some of these commodities globally is controlled by a very small number of large corporations. And that's why it's so important to be thinking about large corporations when we're talking about nature positive and global impacts of biodiversity and supply chains. So do the corporations care about it? Well, some of them definitely do. There's a piece of work which will come out which talks a lot about nature, the paper talks a lot about nature positive in general. And for those of you who want a definition of nature positive, there's many in that paper. So if you want to read that, then please do. It's led by Sophie Suongassen, who's one of our postdocs working here at Oxford. And I just show this picture because it shows on the left the biodiversity commitments made by the Fortune 100, Global 100 companies in 2016. The last time an analysis like this was done, and 5 years later in 2021, and basically shows the degree to which an increasing proportion of those large companies are making some kind of mention or commitment around biodiversity. You can see how the proportions have changed. The story being told there is that increasingly these large corporations are not only talking about biodiversity, they're making strong mentions or even commitments on biodiversity targets. So they are talking about it. Now we're doing a lot of work at the moment to understand the biodiversity impacts of these large organizations, including through their supply chains. Not a lot of it I can talk about in a public lecture because some of it's not published yet and I'm not allowed to. But one example that we can use, which is quite nice and close to home, is the example of the biodiversity impact of the University of Oxford as a large organization. And this is something we published last year. We did this big, for a couple of years, we were working closely as a team of researchers and working with the States and Oxford University here to understand the biodiversity impacts of the University of Oxford as a large organization. And I'll start with the results of that reported in this schematic. Even though it looks like a nice kind of simple schematic, this actually sits upon a big mound of data and extensive calculations. And the size of these circles is proportional to the quantitative proportional impact. So this does give a direct illustration of the relative impact of these different activities from the University of Oxford in terms of their impact upon biodiversity globally. The biodiversity impact is measured in this case in terms of species year, or basically contributions towards local relative species loss globally. And I can talk about that in detail if people want to ask about it later. But essentially, it's a measure of contributions made globally towards species extinction threat, extinction risk. And you can see that it's been broken. We've broken it down for different types of activity that the University of Oxford is involved in. So there's a couple of things to pull out there. One, for example, is how large. So you can, well, I should say first of all, orange is direct impact. So that's things that the university directly controls, and the blue is indirect impact. So the stuff that university doesn't have direct control over, but for example, influences through its supply chains. You can see first of all that the blue impacts are a lot larger than the orange impacts. So a lot of the impacts are indirect and through supply chain. You can see, interestingly, the relatively large impact of food on biodiversity globally. And there's a lot of food expertise and agricultural expertise here in the School of Geography, as I'm sure many of you know. But also just the size of this one, right? And this one is basically big because the embodied biodiversity impact of the stuff that the university buys is absolutely enormous. And amazingly, one of the things we found, or we thought was amazing because we were surprised by it, was one of the largest sources of embodied biodiversity impact at the university is in the research laboratories. It's the stuff being brought in to do the research, right? So if you're worried about the biodiversity impacts at the University of Oxford, you might want to reduce them. But if you want to reduce them, you have to deal with this big biodiversity impact here. And you have to say, well, the University of Oxford needs its research laboratories to exist. I mean, that's one of the reasons the university is what it is. So you can't just avoid those impacts. You have to find a way to deal with them. So that's one of the really important things with this. As soon as you start to look at these global supply chains, think about the real biodiversity impacts that we're having through our supply chains and through the organizations we're involved with, you realize a lot of the impacts we have are really quite mission critical, and we can't just avoid our way out necessarily. We're going to have some impact of some kind. One thing I just mentioned briefly, because I'm going to come back to this case study later on, is just the extent to which now universities around the world are trying to understand their own biodiversity impacts and use similar approaches to do this kind of biodiversity accounting, because just the size of the university sector and the impacts it potentially has are huge, but also the expertise that universities has to deal with it is relatively large as well. And there's now, as partly leading on for this work and led by people like Emily Stott, who's here today, we have a Nature Positive Universities Alliance, which currently has, I think, about 500 or 600 universities and a couple of hundred student ambassadors signed up to try and understand these impacts. So I just wanted to mention that there. Okay, so we have our biodiversity impact assessment. We know we have a huge biodiversity footprint. We know it's through supply chains and a lot of the stuff we do. So how do we deal with it? How do we get from that into nature positive, to this idea of nature recovery? And a typical way to approach it is to structure things around a mitigation hierarchy, or a mitigation and conservation hierarchy. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's start with the mitigation hierarchy. This is one illustration of it. There's many that are similar. But essentially what we're saying is, if you start with some kind of biodiversity impact, in this case in the yellow there, then you can take a sequence of actions to deal with that biodiversity impact. And what you want to do, first of all, is try and prevent those impacts wherever you can, right? I mean, that's the best thing for ecosystems, is if you prevent impacts in the first place. So you start by avoiding and minimizing impacts as much as you possibly can. But then you get to the stage where you've done that as much as you can, and you're still going to have some kind of residual impact on biodiversity. So you have to deal with those somehow. And that's when you get towards the compensatory stage of either remediating some of your impacts or offsetting them. So biodiversity offsets, right? And the reason that I show this is partly because you can see from this kind of illustrative figure that once you get to the stage of offsetting, ideally, you're just compensating for small residual biodiversity impacts. And that can take you up to that black line, which is kind of a neutral overall net outcome on biodiversity. But if you then want to go over that towards positive impacts on biodiversity, then you have to overcompensate with your biodiversity offsetting. And that's what that green bar shows there, is to get towards some kind of net gain in biodiversity, you have to do a lot of offsetting. And this is crucial for a number of reasons. But one is that, you know, if we're serious about this idea of nature positive, if we're serious about this idea of nature recovery, and we're also happy for there to be at least some impact from humans, which means having humans still around, then we need to do some offsetting. We need to do some kind of compensation, because there is going to be a residual impact of some kind. And it's probably going to be quite a large residual impact. So at some stage, if we're serious about nature recovery, we need to offset. So really part of the question about nature positive and will it work or won't it work is partly a question of, can we get offsetting to work? Before we get to offsetting though, we do need to avoid the impacts wherever we can. And as I said with the Oxford example, when the impacts you're having are mission critical, when they're crucial to the operation of your entire organization, then what you want to do, then you can't necessarily avoid them. But you do still need to try and avoid impacts as much as you can. And one of the challenges with that is that avoiding impacts is actually, the more you look into it, the harder it is. This is a figure I'm going to put up just for the sake of having a complicated figure on the slide, so don't try to read it necessarily. But the reason I show this is because we spent this paper trying to work out how you account for avoided biodiversity impacts on projects. And this is the kind of most simple version of the process diagram we could come up with. I mean, admittedly, we're scientists, so we probably overcomplicated it. But at the same time, it's the simplest version we could come up with for a process diagram, working out, you know, when you're actually avoiding your impacts and when you're not avoiding your impacts. So it's actually quite a complicated conceptual thought process to go to work out if you've avoided impacts, before you even get to the stage of having successfully avoided. And that makes it very hard for us to work out whether these kind of approaches that involve efforts towards nature recovery in a kind of a nature positive type way. So the kind of efforts that involve a mitigation hierarchy and some kind of biodiversity offsetting approach to eventually get towards net gain or nature recovery or nature positive, do they actually avoid impacts in the first place? And it's been very hard to quantify that actually. One kind of anecdotal example is the US wetlands case study, which we looked at in a bit of detail. And I use this not because it's proof that these kind of policies can lead to impact avoidance, but it's an interesting example that shows that they might be able to. So what this shows here is that over decades, the trend in US wetland coverage, and the US wetlands were disappearing very, very quickly back in the start of last century. So in the kind of 50s, 60s, 70s, there was movements, well, in the 70s actually, there was movement towards creating a net loss of wetland piece of legislation, which said, you know, the US saying we don't want to lose any more wetlands. You can clear some of them, you can fill some of them in, but you have to replace it with new created or restored wetlands somewhere else, right? So it's one of the precursors to this whole idea of nature positive, is the kind of US Wetland Water Act. And what this shows is over time how the grey diamonds, you can see the population of the US is growing. The solid line, you can see the GDP was growing year on year. And this goes along with trends in increasing urbanization, increasing development, increasing activity on an economic front, all of which would suggest increasing loss of wetlands based on the literature we reviewed here. But you can see the black dots give you kind of estimates of the average, essentially decadal change in wetland area. And that's going up. And what that means, according to the secondary y-axis here, is that basically that you're losing wetlands less and less quickly as time goes by. So basically, something is causing people to clear wetlands less, which is good. That's what we want. I said it in a complicated way, but we want more wetlands. We want them to be cleared less slowly. So this is obviously not a causation analysis. This is not anything like that. You can't show a causal effect between the Water Act and wetlands being preserved more often. But what it does show is that wetlands are being conserved more often than they were before the Water Act. And so that there's at least some correlation there. But also, if you look qualitatively at the kind of literature around this, there's a lot of expert judgment around people just seeing wetlands differently since the introduction of this act. People see them as valuable now, or they didn't see them as valuable in the same way before. So people are making efforts to avoid the impacts, the loss of them. So you have to try and avoid these impacts. That's the starting point for any of this nature positive stuff. It's how can we avoid impacts as much as possible? It has to be the start. But as I said, if we're ever going to get to the stage where we're achieving anything close towards nature recovery, we have to start offsetting impacts somewhere. No matter, I know lots of people don't like the term offsetting, and for good reason, but we have to get offset somewhere. So in these kind of policies, what do the kind of biodiversity gains side look like? What do kind of biodiversity offsets look like? And do they work, crucially? We've done a lot of studies into that. That's been a big part of our work for the last decade, really. And these are a few just examples to illustrate, and again, to get away from graphs and towards nice photos of some biodiversity offset examples around the world. One example is fish habitat being created and restored in Canada to deal with impacts of an oil pipeline. In the middle there, you have native grasslands in Australia that are being restored to help deal with the impacts of urban development and infrastructure development. And on the right there, you have a project where you've got people ranging to prevent secondary indirect impacts of poaching on critically endangered mammal species in Uzbekistan, similar, not that far from where the pictures I showed at the beginning, as a response to offset potential impacts of extractive sector activity, natural gas sector activity. So these are kind of examples, the kind of actual practical conservation measures that are put in place around the world to start to try and provide a gain to counterbalance the losses of biodiversity caused by the supply chain. And these things have been done really widely. I mean, the last effort to kind of catalogue all the biodiversity offsets in the world is one that we were involved in. And what this figure here shows in the top is for all the countries we found evidence of widespread offsetting activity, the darker green is the greater portion of that country's surface area covered by biodiversity offsets. And in some places it's starting to get kind of somewhat significant. What we found was about 13 or 14,000 individual biodiversity offset projects around the world, which is almost certainly an underestimate. And then it took up an area the size of Greece at the time of counting, roughly. I should work out in terms of the number of countries of Wales it is, shouldn't I? Because that's kind of the standard measure. So I didn't do that, sorry, but I'll do it next time. Here on the bottom, you can see the point locations for about 3,000 of those offset projects. One we had data on point locations for. But the point is there's thousands and thousands of these biodiversity offset projects that have already been implemented around the world. These kind of reversing losses and creating habitat or species restoration projects to get gains to counterbalance the losses. So the question is, do they work? I mean, do we actually get the kind of outcomes we want? And again, I'm going to turn some work carried out by Sophos, who I'm guessing. This is a figure from his review, which looks at all the empirical ecological work done to understand whether no net loss or neutral outcomes have been achieved by those kind of biodiversity offset projects globally, given the biodiversity metrics they're using. So have those things managed to actually compensate for the losses of biodiversity or not? And what this figure shows, the thing to focus on, is the big set of bars on the left, figure A there. That looking at the number of projects where there was extensive ecological empirical work done, and asking whether those actually achieved this objective of compensating for the impacts, compensating for the biodiversity losses, you find that in green, somewhere under a half of them achieved that. In red, a big number didn't achieve that. And then there were mixed outcomes or things that weren't able to be assessed for the rest of them. So it's mixed picture is the point. And on the basis of the existing evidence, some of these biodiversity offsets do work. They do result in biodiversity gains that do counterbalance the losses from development activities. In other cases, they don't, or it's mixed. Now, one caveat to this is that best practice has improved a lot since the data were collected that fed into this analysis. And we got told that a lot by a lot of people in industry after we published this work. They were kind of saying, well, it's not fair because, again, practice has moved on a lot in the years since these projects were implemented. And one specific, and we really have anecdotal evidence for that, but one good example of that comes from a fantastic piece of work recently published last year by Kate Devonish and others, including really good researchers in this space like Julia Jones and Banger. And they were looking at a major biodiversity offset, a flagship biodiversity offset project in Madagascar for the Ambatovy mine. And in that case, it's been implemented for about 10 years, 15 years. And it's all about saying the mine is clearing some forest in Madagascar. That's a problem because forest in Madagascar is really nice and had lots of endangered stuff in it. Some very restricted range endemic species, like all kinds of things you don't want to have a mining project on top of. And so what they did was, as a result of their biodiversity offset policy, they put in place a load of measures to prevent losses of forest elsewhere that would almost certainly have occurred. And really what Kate Devonish and others were trying to work out was, were they right about that? Did they actually save forests that would have been lost, almost certainly, to the extent they can actually claim that they did offset the impacts of the mine? So what was the overall outcome? And what they found using a whole host of different statistical models was that basically they did. So this mine managed to prevent enough deforestation, or will have done the lifetime of the mine, to make sure that overall the net impact on forest is actually neutral or positive in Madagascar. There's a lot of caveats with that. Again, one is it's a flagship project, so it's going to get a lot of attention, so they're going to try extra hard to make it work. It's also measuring biodiversity in terms of forest cover, which obviously isn't necessarily the best metric, and there's lots of other things you can say. But at the end of the day, you've got the relatively positive result that a pretty rigorous study of one of these big flagship offset projects says, actually, in this case, we think it did work and it did meet its objectives when it comes to biodiversity. Now, we can't do that all the time, right? We can't always use biodiversity offsets to solve these problems. And a nice illustration of that is a piece of work by Laura Saunter and colleagues, when they basically look at, in this case, 4 different case studies. So you can see the 4 different quadrants of this figure, and you can read the case study areas they were looking at. Using a combination of empirical data and modeling, they were saying if you clear a load of vegetation in all these different case study areas and then try and avoid it or offset it through different measures, through biodiversity offsetting measures, and each set of bars is a slightly different scenario for each one of those case studies, do any of your scenarios get you towards a neutral net outcome on vegetation extent they're measuring it as here? And what they found was that actually no, because in each of these figures, the dashed line is no net loss. That's your neutral impact overall, right? That's where you're saying we've managed to compensate all the impacts with gains of some kind. And in every single one of those cases, you can see, well, almost every one, the case study areas don't see how you could quite get to that level. And that's for a couple of different reasons. But one of the big reasons in all these case studies is that there just isn't enough space, right? You run out of space, you run out of land to actually do the development project and to have the biodiversity offset. So we can't just offset our way out of all these things. We know that. Even if they work, it's not always going to be a solution. So we have to be very careful about how we do it. There's other challenges as well to offsetting which go beyond purely looking at biodiversity as an objective, an objective measure of nature, for want of a better word. And there's been increasingly amount of work into the well-being and the benefits provided to people from biodiversity and how that factors into these kind of biodiversity offset schemes. And remember, the overall focus here is nature positive. And there's a reason it's nature positive and not biodiversity positive. And that's because biodiversity is used to measure nature, of course, but nature is about more than that. It's not just about the objective biodiversity, it's about how we perceive it and rely upon it and culturally value it and use it and so forth. And that's why we're talking about nature positive in a broad sense. So, for example, there's been some really interesting work carried out by Victoria Griffiths, who was a DPhil student here till quite recently. She was looking at a case study of biodiversity offsets in Uganda, East Africa, and this map just shows her case study region. It's where you've got an absolutely enormous dam, hydropower dam, Bujagali, and there's a whole set of biodiversity offsets that are implemented throughout this case study region to compensate for habitat loss caused by that dam. Right? So, not exactly an uncontroversial project. But what Victoria was doing, amongst other things, was she was actually speaking to the people who lived along this river and asking them, what's the perceived outcome of this dam and the associated biodiversity offsets on nature for you? Do you see it as a good outcome, a negative outcome, or do you not really know? Do you care? All these kind of questions. And as one illustration of her findings, the schematic from a 2020 paper, this just is a rough schematic of the river. So you've got the river here with the dam, and you can see that the schematic location of different villages along the river. And basically the different composition of the pie charts shows different overall responses from the hundreds of people she surveyed to find out whether they thought the net impact was positive, negative, or neutral in biodiversity, the dam and the offsets. So the reason for showing that is to say there's a lot of difference between those different pie charts. People have very different ideas, even in a string of closely related villages along one single river system. People have very different ideas about whether biodiversity has been positively or negatively impacted by this single biodiversity offset project. So that's an issue to consider, right? If we're talking about nature positive in general, it's not just about objective measures of biodiversity, it's about the perception of that biodiversity and whether it's valuable or worthy of conservation or not. In this case, one of the really interesting things from Victoria's work, I thought, was that obviously the biodiversity offsets were talking about reforestation through planting native trees. And a lot of the people she surveyed said, actually, we don't want native trees because they're rubbish, things like burning a building and that kind of stuff. So we want, if you could plant anything, plant non-natives. So obviously then it's like, well, okay, how do we do? So, it's challenging as soon as you start to bring in, but you have to bring in people's perceptions of biodiversity. Another quite interesting study in this space was carried out in Western Australia by Hannah Kalioleva, who's finishing up her PhD sometime around now, over the next year or so. And in this study, what she was looking at was a map of, again, empirical data on biodiversity offset projects relative to Perth, down in the bottom left there. And she was looking at development projects in blue and the accompanying offsets in pink, and trying to work out a measure of how much the distance changed from people. So when you implement a development project, it clears biodiversity near some people. Where is the biodiversity offset that compensates for that relative to those people? Is it nearer, further, same distance? And what she's plotting here is evidence that there's a slight change, and these kind of biodiversity offsets tend to move patches of green space, patches of biodiverse green space away from people on average. So people get, there's further away the biodiversity that's compensating for loss. And obviously that's not necessarily a good thing, right? Interestingly, what she did also find was that there was a slight tendency to take biodiversity patches outside of private ownership and put them into public ownership, which is kind of, the opposite direction potentially. But it was just an interesting study to try and get a feel for what's the impact on people of trying to shift biodiversity around the landscape as a mechanism towards eventually getting towards this overall idea of nature positive, nature recovery. And finally, on the biodiversity offset side, just to mention that the real challenges in actually measuring and monitoring this, because unless you measure and monitor it, you can't ever account for, are we even close to nature positive or nature recovery? And that's a real challenge that's been faced. Any country or jurisdiction that's tried to implement these kind of mechanisms struggles with monitoring the outcome of the policy and where the offsets are, whether they're working or not, whether you're getting the ecological gains that you want or not. This is just from a paper by Hini Kujala, looking at how you design the right kind of register to actually capture the information you need to say this is what offsets are and this is whether it's worked or not, and this is whether overall we're going towards nature recovery. So that's another one of a number of challenges to this. Anyway, that's enough about biodiversity offsets for now. People will ask questions in due course. But we'll move back to this slide. Right? This is, if you cast your mind back to the so about half an hour ago, this is when I was talking about the work we did to understand the biodiversity impacts of the University of Oxford as an organisation. So given what we know now about the mitigation hierarchy and conservation stuff with that, how do we then use that to structure an approach towards something like nature positive? How do we take this estimate of biodiversity impacts across different activities and say we're going to get towards a nature positive type strategy for the University of Oxford? And the answer is you can take different approaches. We've got people being admitted into the waiting room, kind of getting in the way of my slides there, but that's fine. Oh, they've gone, amazing. That was well, how much things can I say and they just happen? That's quite powerful, isn't it? So we've got two options there, which are two options we proposed. And again, these are displayed in a relatively kind of illustrative way, but actually are based on the real data. So these proportions are accurate that you see here. And in option one, you can take a really heavy avoidance approach to the University of Oxford's impact. So you can see that in the orange there is the proportion of the overall impacts. So the size of the bar is the overall biodiversity impacts of the university. The orange is saying we can avoid some of those impacts, but that's taking quite a dramatic approach towards avoiding biodiversity impacts. I mean, if you read some of the things there, we're talking about preventing instruction, we're talking about not having a fleet, we're saying no more use of paper, we're saying we're requiring overseas remote working. You know, there's all kinds of things like that that are quite draconian. And you can also then take some minimization measures in light blue there. So you can find a way to prevent a lot of these impacts on biodiversity if you take a very dramatic, let's avoid our biodiversity impacts approach, right? But you still, even under really quite dramatic measures, end up with about a third of your biodiversity impact that somehow you have to offset or compensate. And that's if you take quite a dramatic approach towards avoiding impacts. If you take a slightly more relaxed approach towards avoiding impacts, I mean, you're still cutting, you know, IT use and lab materials by a fifth, for example, and this kind of stuff. It's still a lot of avoidance, but you end up with still 3/4 of your biodiversity impacts that you have to somehow offset if you want to start claiming you're making progress towards nature positive outcomes. So it's challenging. And then a final piece of work I'm just going to talk about today is looking in a bit more detail at one of these aspects, which is food, because we've done a lot of work on that. And obviously, as I said before, we have a lot of serious experts on food and agriculture and environment in the university and in this school as well. So one of the things we looked at as an analysis building on this initial Oxford University biodiversity work was if we look at a specific example of a community within Oxford, and we took a college, which is Lady Margaret Hall, that has a range of different people. What happens if you start to try and implement some of these actions to get you towards mitigating your biodiversity impacts and get you towards nature positive? How do you start doing that? So we looked at food particularly because it's a big source of impact, and it's an interesting one from the point of view of working with a community of people to reduce biodiversity impacts. The results were published just a week ago, led by Isabel Taylor, who's one of those amazing researchers who doesn't stay in academia, and you kind of think, but anyway, she's kind of published this paper and she's gone on to work on consultancy. But this result here shows you for a load of different food stuff. I've said other people in this room are involved in the study too, people like Eleanor and Mike Clark and people like that. What is shown for a range of different food stuffs is the relative quantity of food in the grey bars and the total biodiversity impact in terms of this measure of species extinction risk that I talked about earlier. And you can see, I mean, something like this, not a load of surprises in terms of necessarily where the biodiversity impacts are. You would expect, for example, red meat and poultry to be relatively high impact. Academics always get really sad when we talk about the biodiversity impacts of coffee and tea, unsurprisingly, but it's something we have to deal with, I'm afraid to say. And this study then started to ask, okay, we know then, we have a good estimate of the relative biodiversity impacts of different food products that are consumed by this community of people in this college. So let's look at the actual people themselves. And you start to break it then into different groups of people, right? Students, you've got your support staff, your academic staff. And what this figure starts to show is, what are they responsible for in terms of biodiversity impact? You have your total bar, which is your overall absolute size of biodiversity impact, and then your grey bars in the background give you essentially your intensity of biodiversity impact for those different groups. So for example, you can see that students have a slightly lower intensity of biodiversity impact for the stuff they consume, but there's just more of them, so they consume more, so they have an overall absolute higher impact. And without being able to go into the full detail of this paper, it's really worth reading. Isabel did a fantastic job with this. And what Isabel and the entire team did a fantastic job with this, is the amount of detail that was gone into in terms of trying to work out what people might accept or might not accept as means for reducing biodiversity impacts. And you can immediately imagine that some of these different groups would have very different perspectives on what's appropriate and what's not appropriate for reducing biodiversity impacts, what they'd accept and what they wouldn't accept. We looked at to what extent you can have a top-down approach of saying, you're not eating this, and you're not drinking this, and that's it, and whether that would actually have a good impact or not, versus much more of a bottom-up, what will people accept? Tell us what you're going to change about your diet, and then we'll enforce that consequently. So this is one of the considerations when we start to think about nature positive. It's not just a natural science question of what are the overall biodiversity impacts through the supply chains of the stuff we do. It's also about how do we start to build a strategy based on the fact that people are people and need to make decisions themselves for how they reduce their biodiversity impacts and decisions about what they'll accept. Incidentally, to finish that, there was some modelling done as part of that paper on the cumulative net biodiversity impact. If you're starting to implement a measure of reduction, reduce your biodiversity impacts of your food consumption, but also start to implement things like biodiversity offsets, conservation projects to kind of compensate for those impacts, and looking at what the net cumulative biodiversity impacts might be over time. And this is for a range of different strategies. You've got your business as usual is obviously the highest net impact overall over time. And then you have a range of different versions based on things like the eat, plant, sit diet, but also manage net loss. Like, can you manage net loss over time and reduce it? Or can you implement something much more dramatic and get towards net gain for biodiversity by really restricting what people can eat and drink and being really serious about biodiversity offsetting? And that's when you start to get the curve of biodiversity loss over time bending towards zero, which is good. Right? In this case, for this graph, eventually we want the cumulative net biodiversity impact to slow down and go the other way. So I've taken you on a bit of a kind of whistle-stop tour through a load of work on nature positive and what nature positive is, but particularly some of the realities around, the fact we have to deal with avoiding impacts that might be difficult to avoid for lots of different reasons, but also the fact that if we're going to achieve nature positive, if we're going to achieve nature recovery at scale, we have to deal with these disparate impacts that flow throughout the entire world. We have to deal with the fact that there's going to need to be extensive biodiversity offsets to compensate for our impacts, if we accept there's going to be impacts in the first place. So some concluding thoughts on that. The first thing to say is that this idea of nature positive has momentum, right? It has a lot of backing from the NGO sector, from the private sector, and increasingly policy backing as well. I mentioned, of course, the Global Biodiversity Framework, which backs it in spirit, essentially, if not in name. So there's a lot of backing and momentum, I think, behind this idea, which is a good. We want kind of people to be working together in the same direction. There are methods that exist for calculating biodiversity impacts, calculating biodiversity footprints. Now, they're not easy to implement. They're not always easy to follow or communicate. They're actually quite hard. And there's lots of gaps in these, to be honest, still. And for example, one of our business researchers and University of Oxford researchers here, Talitha Bromwich, is doing a lot of work at the moment trying to carry out these biodiversity impacts footprints and finding all kinds of holes in the methods in the literature to actually calculate them. So there's challenges involved in it. And we're finding out the more we work with a series of organisations as essentially trying to understand that. In fact, I understand we've got some colleagues here from the Dutch dairy sector. We're working with the Dutch dairy sector for some of these, not with the colleagues here, I mean, with other people in the Dutch dairy sector as another example. And it's difficult to carry out these biodiversity footprinting methods, but they do exist and they're increasingly improving. So there's a way of doing this. One of the real big challenges, as I said, is going to be deciding what we want to avoid. Because a lot of the impacts we have are stuff that we really want to keep doing, right? And whether that's academics drinking coffee, or whether it's people producing cotton to make clothes, or whether it's Oxford University carrying out research activities, a lot of these things we want to happen, we want to keep happening. So there's going to be an impact of some kind, but where the things that we avoid, it's going to be really hard to work out what we can and can't avoid as impacts in the first place. And those impacts that we do allow, we're going to need to offset. And biodiversity offsets, we have to get them to work properly, or it's not. None of this is going to be effective. Right? And Yadvinda mentioned at the beginning the recent kerfuffle around Vera and the carbon offsetting thing, and that's a whole different discussion. And I'm looking forward to Patrick's talk about that. But even the word offset in the biodiversity offset space comes with baggage because of the carbon offset space, and that's an issue. So we need to get biodiversity offsetting right, and maybe call it something else as well. But definitely we need to get it right if we're going to achieve this. It's going to be really challenging for many organisations, for many sectors, for many countries to achieve this kind of stuff. We're not going to be able to do it easily at all, no matter how much we'd like to. And in some cases, and this is one of the conclusions from Izzy Taylor's Nature Food paper I presented at the end there, is that it's not something that kind of organisations can do in isolation. It needs to be a concerted effort from lots of different organizations within a sector, from lots of different sectors within an economy, and from lots of different economies working together across the world, effectively. But it's not impossible. I'm an optimist, and that's why I get behind things like Nature Positive. And I think what we've shown is that it can, some of these things can work, right? And I think it is possible. So to answer the question from the beginning, you know, Nature Positive, fact or fiction, Nature Positive, can it work? I think in principle it can work. We can understand our biodiversity impacts, and we can reverse losses, and we can work towards nature recovery. But it's just going to be important to get serious about what the challenges are that are involved with that, and concrete about the solutions we have to solve it. Thank you.
Fascinating. And we'll open up the questions both here and from online as well. I think kind of questions for you. We have 70, 80 people online, so I'll just kick off with one though. A lot of this is based on measuring biodiversity or some metric of biodiversity, which is inherently messy. And without getting into lots of technical detail, could you sort of outline what are the basic principles you do to try and assess the y-axis of all your charts of biodiversity impacts?
Yeah, and it is a really important question, obviously. So how do we measure biodiversity? Some of the analyses we've done has been about using life cycle impact assessment approaches to try and understand the contribution it makes towards extinction risk for species, which is something that involves, you know, a whole load of global commodities flows in different goods and commodities, and then how those are thought to influence biodiversity in different areas, and then the estimates of the species densities in those areas. You told me not to get into technical details, so I'm trying to really doing that. But the point is, it's global estimates of relative species, which is a number of people here can pick apart, easily. But it gives you some indication of relative impacts in terms of likely threat contribution towards threat to the species. There's different approaches that rely upon species abundances, so like mean species abundance in different parts of the world. What's really nice is if you actually have data on the geographical location of the supply chain. Because a lot of the time we're working in these analyses with organizations that don't know where their supply chain is going, which is not unusual. Right? So if an organization does know, if it can say where it gets the stuff from that it's actually buying its supply chain, you can say, well, okay, now we know which landscape we're talking about. We know the activities in that landscape. And we can actually start to do spatial analysis. So, threat to ecosystem integrity and that kind of thing, and actual specific species that are likely to be threatened. So whether you want to take a species habitat or ecosystems approach, you can start to do that. So with better data, you can actually do some quite interesting analysis there. But the problem is, as I say, a lot of the time these big global supply chains are so opaque that it's actually quite hard to know exactly where in the world these impacts are being felt. And that's one of the big challenges with a lot of this work, is actually getting the right data to allow you to do proper biodiversity analysis.
Okay, so there's a quick follow-up there. So if we could get a sector, I think, say oil palm, for example, there's, depending on the supply chain, either you're extracting that from somewhere that's some sort of equilibrium, maybe it's a 50-year-old landscape, which is not causing further biodiversity loss within the past, or it's a deforestation frontier, which is directly associated with massive loss. And so if you know the explicit details of the supply chain, you can separate those. But if you don't know the details, how do you try and do you take an average impact of oil palm? Or
what you're doing is you're saying, I guess you're saying the average impact of oil palm. You're saying that if you're purchasing a certain amount of oil palm and you don't know where it comes from, then you have to work with kind of average consumption of oil palm and say, well, we know globally where most of the oil palm comes from. And as you say, we know in different production landscapes, whether that's involved land use change, like massive clearance of existing habitat, whether that's existing production landscapes which have very different type of biodiversity impacts. So essentially, if you have no information at all about where the oil palm is coming from, then you have to take a starting point saying, what's the average impact of the oil palm globally, which is not sufficient. And that's one of the reasons why I say, these biodiversity footprinting methods, they're a starting point, they need a lot of improvement, there's a lot of gaps. But one of the big things we have to, one of the big recommendations we have to make when we start doing this kind of work for different organizations is often around data, about improving data capture and getting a much better idea about where the impacts are occurring in the world. And it's something that, some organizations are doing a really good job of actually trying to understand, and have some really interesting academic collaborations trying to work out global supply chains and where things come from. Like Trace, for example, out of Stockholm Living Centre, there's quite a few examples. But yeah, that's one of the big challenges. And you have to in the absence of any other information, we're working with global averages, which is kind of a challenge.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I could have more questions. This actually follows on a bit from Jack's point. So I guess I'm a bit concerned sometimes that the outcomes become a bit arbitrary and essentially just reflect the construction of the biodiversity metric. And there's kind of two angles to that. So the practical side is that because many of the metrics, they include a component not just land transformation, but also occupation, with very limited information on management. If you followed it through, it may be that there's actually no ongoing biodiversity decline associated with retaining kind of agricultural land, but that's followed through to an impact scoring indicator. So you kind of question what you actually need to offset. And from a more philosophical point of view, how would you counter the argument that you just can't even begin to compare biodiversity in one region or one location with another? You're kind of barking off the wrong tree to establish a system of trade-offs that implies you can.
Yeah, so fair points.
Could you repeat that question? Sorry, it's for the people online. They're not picking that up. So if you could just maybe restate the main point of that question.
I will, yeah. So I guess there's two parts to the question, and this is where I kind of get to about my own question and answer what I want to answer. That's right. Not the author. There's two. I think there's two parts to the question. One is about being careful with the biodiversity metrics you use, because they can end up being an art. You know, your results can end up being an artifact of the metric rather than reflective of the reality on the ground. And the second one is about. Sorry, that distracted me. What's the second one?
Well, whether it's just kind of fundamentally helpful to transfer biodiversity between locations.
Yeah. So the second part is whether biodiversity is fundamentally fungible, which is essentially the question. So the first bit first. Yes, potentially it's going to be an artifact of the metrics you use, and that's one of the reasons why we have to be careful about it and trying to incorporate uncertainties wherever we can quantify those. So why we have to try and use a suite of metrics. So one thing is we don't have to use one metric; we can use a suite of metrics to kind of triangulate the problem. It's why we have to demand better data and better transparency from the kind of activities that organisations are carrying out and where those organisations are carrying out those activities. So there's a number of approaches we can take towards improving that. But at the end of the day, yes, to some extent, the biodiversity impacts you calculate will be at least partly an artifact, or at least governed by the metrics you use. Now, that's a problem that conservation scientists have to solve, right? Crucially. I mean, that's not a business problem or an organisational government problem. As scientists, we need to come up with a way of developing effective proxies for biodiversity through metrics. Otherwise, they're never going to be measured, and we're never going to be able to account for nature recovery. So that's actually a big scientific challenge. Or we just kind of accept that it's a good enough proxy, right? We've done with tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The second point about the fungibility of biodiversity. So, you know, can you trade? You can't really truly trade biodiversity losses and gains because it's never the same. That is the case. With a lot of these kind of policy mechanisms, they recognise that by saying, you know, your gains have to be as close as possible to your losses. And one of the approaches that organisations, I think, are taking towards nature positive type mechanisms is to say, well, if we can pin down where in the world our impacts are being felt, we can implement our conservation and restoration projects there, so it's as close as possible to what's being lost, right? Even then, you could say that's still not fungible because, you know, on each side of a river, on each side of a tree, things are going to be slightly different. At the end of the day, you have to accept some degree of invented fungibility between losses and gains. And again, I think that comes down to my point of saying, I don't disagree with you, like biodiversity isn't fundamentally exchangeable. But we do have impacts on our activities. So there is going to be a loss of biodiversity somewhere, and it's better, rather than agonising too much over whether that's other than agonising too much over whether that's truly fungible with a restoration project over the road. I think it's better to say, well, there's going to be some impact, and we need to get serious about proactive conservation to somehow balance.
Yeah.
Hi, great talk. Thank you, Joseph. Just an observation, really, Kevin, what you've said with the particular lens of biodiversity, is that if you layer this with regional resilience, so when you're looking at biodiversity offsetting or in terms of restoration, you're thinking about regional resilience and ability to mitigate climate change. So you couple it with other data. Surely that becomes far more compelling. It gives you a marketplace where, for instance, if you've located your biodiversity intervention or offsetting in a particular place that you know that's also going to give benefits around reducing flooding or reduce periods of drought or have complement farming productivity, obviously you're starting to map benefits, you're starting to also map benefits that perhaps has a positive impact on an insurance industry that's insuring homes that are downstream. So I just wondered how far you've taken that, because clearly you're looking at health and well-being, which is kind of that other bit of regional resilience.
Yeah, so
You might repeat that.
to repeat the question, yeah. No, that was a great talk. Thank you very much. No, the question was about strategic ecological compensation, basically. So if you're shifting stuff around the landscape, can you shift it in such a way that you get strategic gain from it? For example, things like flood mitigation and resilience of the wider landscape, in a way that, you know, you can imagine an insurance company benefiting from, right? Paraphrase. Which is an interesting thing. And actually, that is definitely something we're looking at, is saying, if you're doing something like exchanging losses and gains of biodiversity at a very small scale, it can all be very piecemeal. And that's what's kind of happened a lot so far. That image I showed of all the different locations of biodiversity offsets around the world, that's kind of what's happened there. But there's definitely been a movement towards saying, can we be more strategic about it? And can we get an amplified gain if we are very strategic about where we've got our biodiversity components, so that it improves resilience, so that it allows connectivity, so it kind of, you know, which makes a lot of sense. Obviously, in practice, that's really hard to do. It's a great idea in theory, and I think it's the direction we're heading. And a really nice example of that is biodiversity net gain in England. So for those of you who don't know about biodiversity net gain in England, it's essentially saying that from this year, it's going to be mandatory for any development, almost any development project, based on the kind of government metrics, biodiversity, to get us a gain in biodiversity as a result of the development, not just a neutral outcome, but a gain in biodiversity. So the idea is that developments become net kind of improvements towards biodiversity in the landscape. And one of the ideas behind that is that if you offset with if you create offsets under that biodiversity net gain system into local nature recovery networks, then you can actually get that kind of landscape scale strategic. Maybe that's why you're asking the question. So there's definitely the kind of thing that people are trying to do. One of the interesting features of the English biodiversity net gains work, and we're actually studying this in detail, myself, Sophie, as I mentioned, and we have researchers, Emily Rampling, Isabel Hawkins, people like that, working on analysing these data, is that actually, so far, for the early adopters in England, there's very little off-site compensation going on. The vast majority of impacts being dealt with on-site. And whether that's good or a bad thing is another question. But it means that there's less than 10% of the biodiversity gains are going out of the site and into local nature recovery networks, for example. So in principle, it's something that you can do, and I think people are leaning towards trying to do. And it's the kind of thinking that I think we need again to move towards nature recovery. But again, in practice, there are challenges to making that happen. You have to then start enforcing it.
So at COP15, obviously there was a big push to strike this from the text because it was originally in there, and that push was led by women, indigenous communities, and youth, generally around the concept that offsets will target lands that are traditionally in indigenous hands or low-income communities, especially when you're dealing with avoided deforestation offsets. So how do you think that you can address some of those challenges, and is there any effort for social environmental safeguards in a lot of these offsetting frameworks? Because a lot of those communities, I think, had a lot of fear about the nature positive term, because when you have these people stewarding most of the world's remaining biodiversity, there's very few ways to reach a net positive without putting your hands on lands that are already theirs.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think it's a really important point, this issue of the people involved with oh, sorry, I should ask the question again. The question was about COP15 and how there's a lot of concern about nature positive, biodiversity offsetting, those things were struck from the text, partly and argued against by groups including indigenous communities, local communities, and youth, I think you said. Because they were concerned about the efficacy of offsetting, but also the fact it might end up conflicting with indigenous use in the ownership of land. And okay, good. It is a valid concern, and one thing I'd say is that I'm glad it wasn't entirely, some of these targets weren't entirely removed from the text, because during the COP process, obviously, that was a big point of discussion. The fact that people were here who led a kind of an online movement to try and make sure stuff wasn't cut too sharply from the text. Now, I'm not saying it was a bad thing that nature positive was cut from the text, that phrase, but I think it ran the risk at one point of cutting anything quantitative from the text, right, which would have been a disaster, because then suddenly it's just another document saying, we'll conserve stuff at some point in the future, which is not what we want, because then you've got no kind of structure around that, and it's just kind of we'll wake up as we go along. And obviously that doesn't work out well for anyone. But I think the concerns are valid. So the second thing I'll say about that is there's a lot of experience in terms of multilateral banks lending money to big projects and having safeguards on those projects. Some are much better than others, but a lot of those safeguards are around a combination of biodiversity safeguards and then things like indigenous rights safeguards and community safeguards as well. And how those things combine to make sure you don't end up with projects that destroy biodiversity, so you kind of have some conservation or net gain measure in place, but also you've got a whole safeguard designated towards dealing with ensuring that you don't conflict with people's rights and people's ownership of the land. So there's a lot of experience of trying to do that. Again, it's not always done perfectly, it's not always done very well, but in some cases it is. So I think in that case, it's a question of recognizing that. It's one of the reasons I included a couple of slides in here about considering people's use and values of the land as well, and biodiversity as well as just biodiversity itself. And trying to learn from where it's worked effectively in the past and where it hasn't. But I agree, it is a real issue. It's a real issue, and I've been involved in, or brought on as a scientific expert for certain big projects where that's been a fundamental problem. And there's been no space for biodiversity offsets in the landscape, not because there's no space for it, but because there's no groups that, no indigenous groups that are willing to work with the project. And, in that case, it's like, enough. I mean, you can't force that, you shouldn't force that. So then it becomes, a big difference of issues to try and work.
I'd hope to take stuff online, but I've realised it's out of the Zoom on my laptop. So, Stephen, if you while we do the next one, you look through. I think there was an interesting one from Zoe that I noticed earlier. You want to allow that. But while he does that, let's take another one here.
Thank you also very much for it. It's very interesting. I've got one question, and I'm not from the field, so it might be stupid, but it seemed like there is a big discrepancy on where people actually live and where we have, I don't know, some sort of city or agricultural landscape, and where biodiversity is coming. So what do you say, or is there any research about how we can conserve biodiversity within, for example, cities? Is there, do you see potential for that, or do you think it's like not possible?
Thanks for the question. So it's not a stupid question. I'm going to repeat it. The question is saying there's a lot of times we think about biodiversity as being, in one place and humans as being in another. And what do we think about actually sharing space? So there's space for people, whether it's within cities or agricultural landscapes, and biodiversity at the same time. Fair? So, there's a wealth of work, I think, in this space, to be honest. I think, there's a whole debate about the extent to which we have whether we share landscapes with biodiversity and try and conserve it that way, or whether we try and create remote areas where which are strongholds for biodiversity, separate from people, or some mixture of the two, and how we combine those things. So I think there's a lot of debate about the best way to approach it, but obviously at the end of the day, it has to be a mixture. There's absolutely no reason we can't have, components of biodiversity conserved in human-dominated landscapes, right? I think there's absolutely no reason we can't have that. And in fact, I would go further and say that we're never going to achieve nature recovery if we don't also look at the biodiversity that's conserved in urban environments, certainly in agricultural landscapes, in human-dominated landscapes. So the answer to your question is, yeah, it's really important to consider biodiversity and biodiversity conservation within human-dominated landscapes. And I would go further and say that there's no path to nature recovery without doing that, as well as conserving it remotely.
Oh, I would add to that also, urban areas are where most people interface with biodiversity. So we're looking at connections, nature, well-being benefits, urban biodiversity is disproportionate. Importance. Stephen, do you want to channel one from online?
Sure, yeah. So this is from Zoe online. She's discussing the fact that we should also consider the scales of the impacts. So, a mining company deforesting the Amazon is very different to a university department drinking coffee. We need to keep proportional impact in our perspective. And she raises the questions about, are corporations, are they trustworthy stewards of biodiversity? At least in the US, from her perspective, there's a lack of suitable biodiversity protections and restoration, and that's often because corporations have much more influence over policy and can effectively resist meaningful regulations.
Okay, so do I repeat that one now? Or
yes. Yeah, if you can. So yeah, are corporations more trustworthy stewards of biodiversity?
Yeah, no, okay, yeah, so again, two interesting points at least in that question. First of all, about the scale of impacts and whether we should accept, we'll look in detail at the fact that a mining company might have bigger impacts than people drinking coffee in a university, I think the way it was put. And the second point about the power dynamics of corporates and their influence over biodiversity conservation. Two good questions. My initial, my inner monologue when I hear the first question is, yeah, sure, that's true, but where does where do the metals in the university's computers come from? You know what I mean? Like, that's the whole point here, is that university isn't just academics drinking coffee. University is something that has a global supply chain. And those supply chains include those mining companies in those forests. I mean, that's so we can't separate those two things. We have to look at an organization and say, what is the entire value chain? And what impact is it therefore responsible for? And actually, interestingly, the mining as a sector has been doing biodiversity conservation work for decades now. I mean, far more than universities have. I bet that there's more biodiversity experts, like practitioner experts in mining companies than there are in universities, because mining has had to confront its biodiversity impacts because of regulation for decades. Right? So actually, it's not straightforward as just the scale of impacts. I think it's also about where is the expertise and to actually deal with these biodiversity impacts, what the biodiversity impacts are. And also, we can't separate those things and say they're different and distinct and there's one versus the other. We have to see them as an interconnected problem in mines and the universities in that case. Now, I'm not funded by mining companies, just to so that's a scientific opinion rather than a paid opinion. And the second point, speaking of power dynamics, that is the power dynamics for corporates. And I think that there is a question there. There is a question about the disproportionate influence that corporates have on narratives, on kind of policy and legislation and so forth. And that goes into an area of science which is outside of my field, I mean, physical science of corporations and the influence they have. I think it's something we have to be very aware of. And certainly, again, when we publish this work on biodiversity footprinting, increasingly we get organizations come to our research group and say, can you work with us to do this? And there's a very big difference between those that kind of actually genuinely want to understand biodiversity footprints and deal with it, and those that want a ticked box to say, we've done this now, and we're going to pay you, and then everyone can shop about it. So there's quite a big difference, I think, between different corporations. So I think partly it's about, recognizing that some are actually doing quite a good job of this, even if lots aren't. But also that issue of influence is something that has to be dealt with more broadly, I think, and that goes far beyond outside of my own field, how you deal with the disproportionate influence that corporates have. I guess a final note of optimism I would add to that, which is, in case you haven't noticed, I am somewhat optimistic about things in general, is that in some ways, in some respects, that can be a good thing, because you've got corporates that have that degree of control, for example, over a global supply chain, and they do start to do some really quite serious biodiversity impact work and some serious restoration work that can actually have quite a large positive impact. So an example of a company that's doing a lot in this space is Caring. And again, I'm not like a Caring employee, but they do a lot of kind of clothing and luxury and fashion stuff, which again, I don't wear, in case you couldn't tell. But for years, they've been trying to understand the environmental impacts of their supply chain. And they've started to include biodiversity in that. They've started to try and calculate the global biodiversity supply chain impacts and deal with them. And they've launched kind of global restoration projects to try and restore habitats in their supply chains. And it's actually, I mean, to me, it's interesting to see what they're doing and saying, actually, that's potentially quite beneficial what they're doing in that case. So that's another optimism, but certainly an issue that has to be dealt with, yeah.
Yes, I think a few more questions. Thank you. You mentioned the DEFRA biodiversity metric earlier on.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in your views on it. You feel good, bad, or indifferent?
You really summarise it.
Yeah, that was actually a very succinct. The DEFRA biodiversity metric, which is for biodiversity net gain in England. What are my views on it, essentially? Good, bad, or indifferent. So, the DEFRA biodiversity metric, I think, if you're asking me as a kind of conservation scientist, as an ecologist, does it accurately reflect biodiversity? Not really, obviously, because that's not the only thing it's designed to do. It does, and it's not a bad effort. It's trying to act as a proxy for biodiversity. It's based on habitat and condition, which is not a perfect proxy, but it's better than, for example, just a habitat area. It's better than some other measures of biodiversity that you might try and choose. But it's not perfect. It's kind of not only, you got to remember, it's not only designed as a metric to accurately reflect biodiversity. It's also designed as something that can actually be used by a whole load of people who aren't biodiversity specialists. And so in terms of it being a metric that's trying to strike a balance between being a proxy for biodiversity, but also something that can be widely used at scale to try and incorporate biodiversity, habitat, high condition habitat into development activities, I think is actually not bad. It's the end of a process of extensive consultation and development over more than a decade. So there's been a lot of people fed into developing it to say, what's the best version of this we can come up with. So, I say it's kind of on the road to being actually quite useful. It's still not perfect yet, and it still needs to be modified, I think. And there's things we found when we're doing analyses of the outcomes of biodiversity net gain in England and biodiversity net gain developments. We see quite interesting outcomes and the kind of thing you don't really want to happen, partly in some cases as a result of the metric. For example, it incentivizes certain types of habitat restoration over shorter timescales just because of the construction of the metric, which is not what we necessarily always want. So it's definitely not perfect, it needs work still. But I think a final thing I'd say about the DEFRA metric in England is that, like any other biodiversity metric, it's trying to satisfy a number of different things at the same time. We know it's not a perfect proxy, but actually the main thing about the metric is who wields the metric, who actually uses it, right? And the big problem with DEFRA and BNG, the big problem with the DEFRA metric, biodiversity net gain, I'd say is less the metric itself and more like other sufficient resources to actually implement this policy. Because if you have experienced, knowledgeable ecologists and all the councils across England who actually know what they're doing and how to use the metric, and enabled to use it effectively, then actually it's probably okay, right? About ecology at all to implement it and make mistakes and no one has the time to check it and just says, yeah, fine, that's part of through the system. And no, it's not a good metric at all. So I think for me, it's less about the metric in that case, because I think it has its strengths and weaknesses, and more about how it's implemented and who's implemented.
I'm thinking back to avoidance. We talked a lot about offsetting, but avoidance. When you look at the slide with the paper of looking at Lady Margaret Hall, there was a lot of the avoidance options also overlap climate change. And I was thinking, how do you discriminate in messaging around this? Is it too complicated to talk about biodiversity offsetting and biodiversity avoidance, destroying biodiversity and climate change separately, or do you think it should be sort of parceled up into one when you try to get people to change habits?
I think it should be all it should be aligned, and we should talk about it at the same time. And in fact, I think nature positive, the kind of way people are leaning with it is also about, can we do this alongside, climate change mitigation and adaptation and deal with carbon at the same time? So I think we can talk about them at the same time. And in fact, I think we should talk about it at the same time. And there's obviously a lot of people in different groups here at Oxford. I mean, I'm thinking these Natalie Seddon's group from Nature-Based Solutions, who are trying to explore ways that we can meet carbon and biodiversity goals at the same time. So I don't think it's too complicated. I mean, it's obviously there is an element of complexity to it, but I don't think it's too complicated to try and align this thing. But I think if we don't align them, it's going to make our job much harder.
Steve, are there any other more online?
Yeah, we have one more online from Julian. What are your thoughts on the development of science-based targets for nature? The draft methods outline a wide range of biodiversity metrics for business. Is this feasible for companies to operationalize?
Thanks. So I'll just again repeat briefly. So science-based targets for nature publishes an approach towards for corporates to follow to set their own targets for kind of biodiversity conservation. Is it, it's been published online, the initial beta version of the guidance. Is it feasible and is it going to work? So I think with the science-based targets for nature, science-based targets in general, I think is a good idea, actually. I think if you look at the science-based target for climate, the idea of basically saying to corporations, we can take the overall Paris Agreement target on climate change, the limits we set, we can quantify the contribution made by different sectors, we can look at therefore the contribution your company makes to your sector, and therefore we can tell you exactly what the target is to reduce emissions by to contribute towards the overall Paris Agreement targets for climate change. I think in principle that's a good idea, and I think it's had a lot of buy-in from corporates as a result, because it's kind of a nice concrete way of saying this is what you have to do. If you want to align yourself with what everyone's saying, what global policy is, this is what you have to do on climate change. Now, it's obviously, in a way, quite challenging for biodiversity, not least because we don't have the same kind of biodiversity metric and target that we do for, that's analogous to what we have for climate change and carbon. So I like the idea of a science-based target, an environmental science-based target. I think it's probably quite effective in some ways, the one that we have for climate change. I don't think the science-based target network yet have come up with a final kind of, this is how you do it for nature. I think that's in process, and they're due to publish stuff this year. I'll be interested to see what they publish. I think it's going to be challenging. I think before they publish something that is equivalent to the climate science-based target, there needs to be some more convergence around what metrics we use. So at the moment, the science-based targets for nature talk about a range of metrics that you can use, but not one that you should use, or one that's a small set that you should use. And I think that remains the big challenge when it comes to things like science-based target network is, how do we coalesce as a group of people trying to reduce biodiversity impacts and achieve nature recovery? How do we coalesce around a set of metrics that are actually, we're all okay with and we're happy to use and we think are sufficiently robust?
One final question. You're doing a really good plan. Vic, do you want to go? No.
Thanks for the talk. I really appreciate the positive vision. Could you give any insight into how the impacts on biodiversity in the Oxford study translated into those policy recommendations, like with the 2 bars? Because it struck me that different priorities and values would lead to very different recommendations.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So the question was, well, first of all, thanks for the positive vision, which I think we should all have as much as possible, conservation optimism. But also, with the Oxford study, how did the impacts translate into different sets of strategies towards getting towards nature positive or that type of target? Because a lot depends on the different values you have, the kind of strategy you take towards getting there. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And actually, what we did with the Oxford study was we really did the biodiversity impact footprint, biodiversity footprint in the first place, and so this is where a lot of the impacts are, relatively speaking, and then said, here's a whole load of different types of strategy you could take towards getting towards no net loss or net gain for biodiversity. So you could focus on, transport, or food, or supply chain, or some combination of those things. We were our kind of research there was more about saying these are the different options you might have, rather than saying here's what you should do, right? Which is why I only had 2 options there, but we had quite a lot of different options. That was why the fact that the strategy you take depends a lot on values that people have and what they see as important or not important, or what they see as willing to sacrifice or not sacrifice, actually, as much as anything. Depends a lot on the people. That's why we did the nature food analysis for Lady Margaret Hall, because that was starting to look in a bit more detail at, okay, if we actually speak to people who are going to have to live with these decisions under the strategy, what do they think about it? And what would they prioritise or not prioritise? Because exactly as you say, one thing is to do an objective-ish biodiversity footprint and say this is where the impacts are, and this is the best way of getting towards no net loss or nature positive. Another thing is to say, how do we actually do it in a way that people are happy with and people will accept? And that is a really big part of the challenge that I think we're moving on to now. So
Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll wrap up there. And thanks, Joe, for handling a wide range of questions. We have reached the Stella corridor, so you can go. Yeah.